a very severe increase in unemployment in many parts of the developed world, but unemployment is really not an option in the developing world, where you cannot, unemployment basically means, you don't survive. So you basically eke out a living on very modest incomes and so on and so forth. So I think part of the difficulty of this presentation will be to switch between the financialization and the impacts of the financial crisis and looking at the larger picture and particularly at the global picture. Now, I think what is generally agreed on is that the process of so-called financial globalization over the last 3 decades has actually resulted in what people like Roma refers to as a flow of capital uphill. Okay, and this is something which neoclassical economists would recognize as something which is against what they predict. For others, it's less problematic and it's quite predictable. And what we do know is that there has been a net flow of capital from the capital rich, from the capital poor to the capital rich, from the south to the north. And I'll come back to this in a moment, but the US, as you know, in the recent period has been the single largest recipient of capital flows and has been the single largest borrower in the world. The other thing, of course, to remember is that in the recent period, the cost of funds has not gone down because of financial deepening. Okay? The arguments for financial deepening is that you would have better intermediation and a whole range of other effects which would reduce the cost of funds. Now, that has not happened. We do have, however, in the recent period, a lower cost of funds because of the dominant position of the US economy and the fact that the US Federal Reserve has deliberately, since the 2001 recession, kept interest rates low or relatively low, and this obviously has had an effect globally, and this is something which has been relatively benign. So this basically gives you a sense of the US accounting for half, and developing countries will constitute less than a fifth of the total amount of the capital recipients account for less than, as I said, for less than a fifth. Now, over the longer term, you can get a sense of the net flow of funds from the developing countries to the rich countries as aggregated, represented by the blue line, which goes down to the bottom. So there has been a significant net flow of funds from developing countries to the rich countries over this period. Now, one important element which is familiar to this audience, I'm quite sure, is the fact that personal savings rates, household savings rates have not exactly been very high in the United States for a fairly long period of time. The current phenomenon, the recent phenomenon, is exceptionally low, partly because we have, in some years, we have actually seen a negative savings rate. Of course, how you measure this depends also on methodology, and here the blue line represents a national income sort of accounts estimate, and the flow of funds is represented by the red line. Now, all this, I think, as we all know, contributed to rather loose monetary policy and the housing bubble, and I won't get into that right now. One important element in the public debate I just want to put away is, if we look at the US current account deficit as represented by the purple bar down there, you can see it is far, far bigger than for any single country or any single region, and especially I want to highlight the relatively small proportion of the Chinese surplus compared to the US deficit. So it is the US running a huge deficit against the rest of the world, against not only China, but also the oil exporters of the Middle East, and also Germany and other such countries. Now, in the more recent period, you've seen some closing of the reduction of the imbalances which have characterized the recent period. And again, what this bars highlight for you very clearly is the fact that the Chinese surplus is actually of a fairly recent origin. It is true that China has for decades run a huge surplus vis-a-vis the US, but it has run deficits with the rest of Asia. It has run deficits with Africa and so on and so forth. So this, I think it's important to have a sense of the global dimensions of the US deficit and as well as the Chinese surplus. Now, we all know that about 60 developing countries are expected to have gone into recession last year, and our estimates are about 3.5% contraction last year at the world level. This is uneven. Developed economies, the contraction on a per capita basis is about 4%, and developing countries, on average, is pretty is close to zero. But of course, as you know, with China growing at about 8+%, and India growing at a fairly brisk clip, Brazil doing not too badly, it does mean that it covers up, because of the size of the Chinese economy and so on, it obscures the fact that quite a number of developing countries have been doing pretty badly. Now, most developed countries seem to be coming out of the recession since the middle of last year, and there is uncertain recovery in the transition economies as well, and recovery below potential in developing countries. We know that there was a significant collapse of world trade last year, and I want to come back to that in a minute. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that exports from developing countries fell much more precipitously, as represented by the green line there, compared to OECD exports. Now, this was particularly reflected, or maybe it's a reflection of as well, the fall of mineral prices, both oil as well as other as metals. And food prices, although lower than their peaks at the end of 2007 and early 2008, continue to remain higher than the trend for the early and the middle part of the decade. So to summarize the trade impacts, basically what we find is that the exports have declined for pretty much all developing countries. The terms of trade have moved, particularly against primary exports, especially against mineral exports, and trade surpluses and reserves have been run down very quickly. It's important to emphasize that because quite a number of middle-income countries did accumulate reserves, did have much smaller fiscal deficits going into this crisis compared to the crisis in the 1990s. Now, the main silver lining, I guess, from a consumer point of view is the fact that energy prices and food prices have come down fairly significantly. Now, what are the social impacts? The estimates are all over the place, quite frankly. I mean, the ILO made some estimates at the end of 2008, and I'm not sure how accurate those estimates are, and they need to be severely revised. And by the way, the ILO estimates were made at a time when the IMF was still pretty optimistic about the prospects for 2009. The IMF, by 2009, however, became much more pessimistic, but the ILO did not revise its estimates accordingly. Now, in terms of its significance for governments, I think there is a broad sense of how significant this crisis is, and this is reflected in various different kinds of ways. The U.S. intelligence community agreed early last year that that the crisis represents a greater security risk, and some of the recent statements of President Obama and many other leaders in the world recognize this whole issue. Now, let me give you a sense of what has been done, the initiatives of the G20 in response to the crisis. Now, almost 20 billion has been committed to not only to fiscal stimuli but other related recovery efforts. 20 trillion. I can't. I'm not used to saying such numbers, but and I'm referring to American trillions for those of you who are British. 20 trillion. And I just want you to look at the ODA to Africa in 2008. Just in case you can't see it from the back, it's that sliver under the line 26 billion, okay? Now, this gives you a sense of proportion, okay, of how much transfers there are, how much willingness there is to act on various things, including the MDGs and so on and so forth. Now, one of the significant